The Eternal Empire had ruled the stars for 12,000 years. No one remembered a time before them. No one dared to imagine a time after them. They were eternal, just as their name promised. Their ships were the most powerful in the galaxy. Their armies were without number. Their technology was so advanced that younger species thought it was magic. High Archon sat upon his throne on the capital world of Prime. He was old, even by the standards of his long-lived species. He had seen empires rise and fall. He had crushed rebellions with a wave of his hand. He had ordered the deaths of billions without losing a moment of sleep. To him, the galaxy was a garden, and he was the gardener. Some plants were useful and allowed to grow. Others were weeds to be pulled out and burned. On this particular day, one of his advisors approached the throne with news that barely seemed worth mentioning. "High Archon," the advisor said, bowing low, "our long-range sensors have detected radio signals from an unexplored system, a yellow star with 8 planets. The third planet shows signs of primitive civilization." Did not even look up from the reports he was reading. Primitive? How primitive? They have only recently discovered how to split the atom. They have sent a few of their kind to their own moon. They broadcast entertainment signals into space without any attempt to hide themselves. They are divided into many nations that fight each other constantly. Now looked up, but only with mild curiosity. A fractured species. They have not even united their own world. No, High Archon, they call themselves humans. They are aggressive, emotional, and short-lived. Our analysis suggests they would make poor slaves, too rebellious, too unpredictable. Nodded slowly. He had heard this story 1,000 times before. The galaxy was full of young species that had just discovered fire or built their first cities. Most were simply ignored until they developed something useful. Those that showed too much aggression were dealt with quickly. "What is your recommendation?" asked, though he already knew the answer. "Extermination, High Archon. They breed quickly and they are violent by nature. If we leave them alone, they may become a problem in a few thousand years. Better to remove them now while they are still weak." Agreed. It was the logical choice. The kind choice, really. A quick death was better than the slow suffering of a species that would never be able to compete with the Empire. He would be doing them a favor. "Send the third conquest fleet," ordered. "Tell Commander that I want this finished within 1 cycle. No survivors, no records. When he is done, I want it to be as if this species never existed." The advisor bowed and hurried away to deliver the orders. The third conquest fleet was not the largest fleet in the Empire, but it was more than enough for this task. 200 warships, each one capable of destroying a city with a single shot. They had conquered dozens of worlds and had never known defeat. The officers who served on these ships were young and eager. They saw this mission as an easy way to earn glory. Some of them even made bets on how quickly the primitive humans would surrender. Commander was a veteran of many campaigns. He had burned worlds and shattered civilizations. He looked at the data on the human species and felt nothing but contempt. These creatures had not even developed faster-than-light travel. They were still using chemical rockets to push themselves into space. Their weapons were crude. Their defenses were non-existent. This would not be a battle. It would be a harvest. As his fleet prepared to depart, addressed his officers. "This mission is beneath us," he said honestly. "These humans are not warriors. They are animals. They have never seen a true starship. They have never faced a real enemy. When we arrive, they will panic. They will beg. And then they will die. I expect this to be finished before the next meal cycle." His officers laughed and cheered. They were already celebrating a victory that had not yet happened. The fleet jumped into hyperspace, crossing the vast distance between Prime and the human in a matter of days. As they traveled, the officers continued to make jokes about the primitive species they were about to destroy. They looked at images of human cities and mocked their simple architecture. They listened to human music and found it crude and unpleasant. They watched human entertainment broadcasts and laughed at the strange creatures who thought they were the center of the universe. None of them stopped to ask an important question. None of them wondered why a species so primitive had survived so long on a world so dangerous. None of them considered what it meant that humans had built weapons capable of destroying their own civilization. None of them thought about what kind of species would create such weapons and then choose not to use them. They had made a mistake that powerful empires often make. They measured only what they could see. They counted ships and weapons and technology. They calculated industrial output and population numbers. By every measurement they used, humans were weak and helpless. But there were things that could not be measured, things that did not show up on sensors or in reports. They did not understand the human capacity for fear and how fear could transform into rage. They did not understand human stubbornness, the way a human would rather die than kneel. They did not understand human creativity, the ability to turn anything into a weapon. They did not understand human unity, the way that humans who hated each other would stand together against a common enemy. Most of all, they did not understand human memory. Humans remembered everything. They remembered every wrong done to them. They passed those memories down through generations. They built monuments to their fallen. They told stories of their defeats so that their children would grow up hungry for revenge. The Eternal Empire had ruled for 12,000 years because no one had ever truly challenged them. They had forgotten what it meant to fight an enemy that would not surrender. They had forgotten what it meant to face a species that was not afraid to die. They were about to remember. As the third conquest fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the human solar system, Commander looked at the blue and green world that hung in the distance. It looked so small, so fragile, so easy to break. He smiled and gave the order to advance. He had no idea that he was leading his ships into a trap that would change the galaxy forever. The third conquest fleet appeared in human space like a storm rolling over the horizon. 200 warships, each one larger than anything humans had ever built, hung in the darkness beyond Neptune. Their arrival sent gravitational waves rippling through the solar system. Human observatories detected the disturbance within minutes. On Earth, alarms began to ring in military bases around the world. Telescopes turned toward the outer planets. Satellites adjusted their sensors. And then the images came through and the world fell silent. Ships, massive ships, alien ships. For a brief moment, humanity held its breath. Some people prayed. Some people screamed. Some people simply stared at their screens in disbelief. After centuries of wondering if they were alone in the universe, humans finally had their answer. They were not alone. And whatever was out there did not come in peace. Commander did not wait long before announcing his presence. He broadcast a message in 17 human languages, words that his translators had pieced together from intercepted radio signals. Creatures of this world, his voice boomed across every frequency. I am commander of the Eternal Empire. Your planet now belongs to us. You have one choice. Kneel before us and some of you may be allowed to serve. Resist, and you will be erased from existence. You have one rotation of your planet to respond. The message ended. Leaned back in his command chair, confident that the primitive humans would spend the next day fighting among themselves before finally surrendering out of fear. But humans did not respond the way he expected. In bunkers and war rooms across Earth, leaders who had spent their entire lives preparing for wars against each other suddenly found themselves facing a common enemy. Old grudges were set aside. Secret communications channels opened between nations that had not spoken in decades. Within hours, a coalition was formed. It was messy and imperfect, but it was unified in one belief: they would not kneel. The response came from a haired general who had survived 3 wars on his own soil. He had seen cities burn. He had buried friends and enemies alike. He knew what it meant to fight against impossible odds. His voice was calm and steady as he broadcast humanity's answer. "This is General speaking on behalf of Earth. We received your message. Here is our response. This is Terran space. You are not invited here. You are not welcome here. Leave now or we will make you leave. There will be no second warning." On the bridge of his flagship, Commander listened to the message and laughed out loud. His officers joined him, the sound echoing through the ship. A primitive species with chemical rockets was threatening the eternal empire. It was absurd. It was comedy. "They have spirit," said, wiping tears of amusement from his eyes. "I almost admire them. Almost. Begin the advance. Let us show these creatures what real power looks like." The fleet moved inward, passing the outer planets one by one. They made no effort to hide themselves. Why would they? They wanted the humans to see them coming. They wanted the humans to understand the hopelessness of their situation. Human military commanders watched the approaching fleet with growing dread. They knew their weapons were primitive by comparison. Their fastest ships would take months to reach the enemy. Their missiles were designed to travel thousands of kilometers, not millions. Everything they had built was meant to fight other humans, not aliens from the stars. But they were not ready to give up. They could not give up. Surrender meant extinction. General had read the intercepted communications from the alien fleet. He knew what the plan for humanity. There would be no mercy. There would be no negotiation. This was a fight to the death. So humanity did what it had always done in moments of crisis. It improvised. Missiles launched from hidden silos across Earth, Luna, and Mars. Thousands of them, screaming through the void toward the alien fleet. They were crude weapons, nuclear warheads strapped to rockets that had been designed for a different kind of war. But they were what humanity had, and humanity used them. Commander watched the swarm of missiles approaching and felt a moment of surprise. The humans were actually fighting back. It was foolish, but it showed courage. He respected courage, even in inferior species. "Point defense systems active," he ordered calmly. "Destroy the missiles." The defense systems worked perfectly. Beams of light flashed through space, turning the human missiles into clouds of harmless debris. Not a single warhead reached its target. The bridge crew barely had to pay attention. It was like swatting insects. "Is that all they have?" one officer asked with contempt. Opened his mouth to respond, but the words never came. Because the missiles had never been the real attack. While the sensors tracked the obvious threat, 12 small ships had been drifting silently through space. They were cargo vessels, hastily converted into weapons. They carried no advanced technology, no shields, no weapon systems. They carried only nuclear warheads, dozens of them packed into every available space. They had launched days ago, before the fleet even arrived, positioned by humans who had guessed where the enemy would appear. The crews of those 12 ships were volunteers. They knew they would not survive. They had recorded final messages for their families. They had made peace with their gods, and when the moment came, they did not hesitate. 12 ships detonated simultaneously against the rear of the formation. The explosions were blinding. Nuclear fire consumed 17 warships in an instant. Shields that had never been tested against such primitive weapons failed completely. Thousands have died before they even knew they were under attack. On his flagship, Commander was thrown from his chair as the shockwave hit. Alarms screamed. Damage reports flooded in. His officers stared at their screens in disbelief. 17 ships, gone just like that. Pulled himself up and looked at the tactical display. Where 17 of his warships had been, there was now only debris and radiation. "How," he whispered, "how is this possible?" No one had an answer. They had not lost a battle in 400 years. They had conquered species far more advanced than humans. They were the masters of the galaxy. And yet, in one moment, a primitive species with nuclear weapons and courage had done what no one else had managed in centuries. They had made the Empire bleed. felt something he had not felt in a very long time, something cold and uncomfortable settling in his chest. It was fear. And on Earth, as news of the impossible victory spread, humans began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. High Archon received the news in his throne room. An advisor stood before him, trembling with fear, delivering words that no one had spoken in 400 years. High Archon, the Third Conquest Fleet has suffered losses, 17 ships destroyed. Commander requests reinforcements. Sat in silence for a long moment. The words did not make sense to him. Losses. Against primitives. Against a species that had not even developed faster than light travel. Explain, he said, his voice cold and dangerous. The advisor explained. The ambush. The nuclear weapons. The suicide attack. The impossible courage of a species that should have surrendered at the first sight of warships. When the explanation was finished, rose from his throne. His ancient face was twisted with rage. This was not just a military defeat. This was an insult to the Empire, an insult to him personally. Send the first armada, he commanded. 2,000 ships. I want that planet turned to glass. I want every human dead. I want their world salted so that nothing will ever grow there again, and I want Commander executed for his failure. The first armada was the pride of the Empire. It had crushed rebellions across 100 star systems. It had never known defeat. Surely, 2,000 ships would be more than enough to destroy one primitive world. But the armada needed time to assemble, time to travel across the vast distances of space. And in that time, humanity was not sitting idle. On Earth, the news of the first battle spread like wildfire. 17 alien warships destroyed. It seemed impossible, but the evidence was there. The wreckage of alien ships drifted through space, proof that the invaders could be killed. Fear transformed into something else. Hope, determination, rage. Humans who had spent their lives fighting each other suddenly found common purpose. Old enemies became allies. Secret weapons programs were shared openly. Scientists from rival nations worked side by side, studying the debris of destroyed ships. And they learned fast, terrifyingly fast. What took the centuries to develop, humans figured out in months. They did not fully understand the alien technology. They did not need to. They only needed to copy it well enough to make it work. Factories that had built cars began building warships. Universities became weapons laboratories. Every city became a fortress. Every citizen became a soldier, in spirit if not in training. General stood at the center of it all, coordinating the impossible effort. He slept only a few hours each night. He ate meals at his desk. He watched the progress reports with growing hope and growing fear. Will it be enough? His aide asked one night. Looked out the window at the night sky, knowing that somewhere out there, a fleet of 2,000 ships was coming to kill everything he loved. It has to be, he said simply, because there is no other option. When the first armada finally arrived in human space, they expected to find a terrified world waiting to surrender. Instead, they found a species transformed. Human ships rose to meet them. They were crude by standards, built with stolen technology that the humans barely understood. But there were hundreds of them, far more than they had expected. And they were crewed by men and women who had already accepted that they might die. The Battle of Saul began on a Monday morning, Earth time. It lasted 19 days. They had superior technology, superior numbers, superior experience. They should have won easily. But humans did not fight the way they expected. They used their own ships as weapons, ramming them into enemy vessels when their weapons failed. They deployed nuclear warheads as mines, hiding them among asteroid fields and detonating them when ships passed by. Their pilots flew suicide missions without hesitation, crashing their ships into the bridges of enemy flagships while broadcasting defiant messages until the moment of impact. For every human ship destroyed, 3 more launched from hidden shipyards in asteroid belts and lunar craters. They could not understand it. Where were all these ships coming from? How could such a primitive species build so quickly? The answer was simple. Humans had spent their entire history preparing for war, not against aliens but against each other. They had thousands of factories, millions of workers, centuries of experience building weapons of destruction. When those resources were united against a common enemy, the results were terrifying. The commanders tried every strategy they knew. They attempted to blockade Earth. Human ships broke through. They tried to destroy the shipyards. Humans had hidden backups. They tried to target human leaders. Humans simply promoted new ones. And through it all, the humans kept fighting. They did not surrender. They did not retreat. They did not negotiate. On the 15th day, the fleet commander sent a message to the humans, offering terms for surrender. General's response was simple: "We do not know that word." On the 19th day, the First Armada, 2,000 ships, the pride of the Eternal Empire, retreated from human space. Less than 300 ships survived. The battle was over. Humanity had won. On Earth, people poured into the streets to celebrate. They had faced extinction and survived. They had fought the most powerful empire in the galaxy and made it run. But General did not celebrate. He stood alone in his command center looking at the casualty reports. Millions dead, cities destroyed, resources exhausted. And he knew the truth that others did not want to hear. This was not the end. This was only the beginning. The Empire would not accept this defeat. They would come again with more ships, with more weapons, with more determination. Humanity had won a battle, but the war was far from over. Looked at the stars and made a decision. Humanity could not simply wait for the next attack. They could not remain on the defensive forever. If they wanted to survive, they would have to take the fight to the enemy. They would have to make the Empire fear them. He began drafting new orders, plans for new ships, plans for new weapons, plans for an attack that they would never see coming. The humans were done running. Now it was time to hunt. The Eternal Empire expected humanity to hide. They expected the primitives to build walls around their solar system and pray that no one would come for them again. They expected fear. They were wrong. 5 years after the Battle of Sol, the first human warships appeared in Imperial space. They came without warning, dropping out of faster-than-light travel in systems that had known nothing but peace for centuries. They struck hard and fast, destroying military installations, supply depots, and communication relays. Then they vanished before reinforcements could arrive. The attacks made no sense to them. Why would a species that had barely survived attack a power that could still crush them? Why take such risks? Why invite more destruction? The answer was simple, but they could not understand it. Humans remembered. They remembered the invasion. They remembered the casual cruelty of the ultimatum. They remembered the millions who had died in the Battle of Sol. And they had intercepted every communication during the war, every joke about exterminating vermin, every bet about how quickly Earth would fall, every casual discussion of genocide. Humans did not forget, and humans did not forgive. General had retired by then, his body worn out by years of stress and sleepless nights. But his successor, Admiral Sarah, had learned well from him. She had been a young officer during the first invasion. She had watched her friends die in the Battle of Sol. She had sworn an oath over their graves. The oath was simple: they would pay for what they had done, every single one of them. Admiral called her strategy the doctrine of reciprocity. For every world the Empire had threatened, humanity would take 3. For every human who had died, 100 would answer. It was not about conquest. It was about justice. It was about making the Empire understand that they had awakened something that would never stop hunting them. Human ships appeared everywhere. Border systems, trade routes, mining colonies. Nowhere was safe. They tried to defend everything and found themselves defending nothing. And the humans were not alone. The Eternal Empire had ruled for 12,000 years. In that time they had conquered hundreds of species. They had enslaved billions. They had crushed every rebellion, broken every resistance, destroyed every hope. But now there was a new hope, a species that had faced the Empire and won, a species that proved that could be beaten. Human ships carried more than weapons. They carried messages, recordings of the Battle of Saul, stories of how humanity had stood against the Empire and survived, offers of alliance, offers of weapons, offers of freedom. The recordings spread like a virus through slave populations across the Empire. Species that had been broken watched in amazement as primitive humans destroyed warships. They listened to generals' defiant response to the surrender demand. "We do not know that word." They saw proof that the masters were not gods. The masters could bleed. The masters could lose. Rebellions began on a dozen worlds. Slave workers sabotaged factories. Underground movements formed and grew. Species that had not spoken to each other in centuries began to coordinate, using human communication technology smuggled past sensors. High Archon watched his empire begin to crack. He had ruled for so long that he had forgotten what true opposition looked like. He had believed that the empire was eternal, that nothing could challenge supremacy. Now he saw the truth. The empire had not been strong. It had simply never faced a real enemy. "How do we stop them?" he demanded of his generals. "How do we kill these humans?" His generals had no answers. Human ships were faster than they should be, more maneuverable than expected. Human tactics were unpredictable, almost insane by standards. They accepted losses that would shatter any Imperial fleet's morale. One general tried to explain. "The humans fight differently than any species we have encountered. They do not calculate acceptable losses. They do not retreat when the odds turn against them. They seem to believe that death in battle is preferable to surrender. We do not know how to fight an enemy that does not fear death." Dismissed the explanation. He did not want to understand the humans. He wanted to destroy them. He ordered a new strategy. If the humans could strike at Imperial systems, then the Empire would strike at the human. One massive attack, every ship the Empire could gather, aimed directly at Earth. Destroy the source and the threat would end. But preparing such an attack took time. Ships had to be recalled from across the Empire. Supply lines had to be established. And while they prepared, the humans continued their campaign of destruction. More systems fell. More rebellions erupted. More species joined the cause. The empire that had stood for 12,000 years was bleeding from 100 wounds. Admiral received intelligence about the planned attack on Earth. She had expected this. She had planned for this. While human ships raided Imperial territory, other humans had been working tirelessly to prepare for the final confrontation. Earth had become something new, a fortress, a weapon, a trap. Orbital platforms bristled with weapons that mixed human creativity with stolen technology. Asteroid bases had been converted into massive missile batteries. Automated defense drones numbered in the millions, ready to swarm any enemy fleet. And at the center of it, all waited a human fleet crewed by the sons and daughters of those who had fought in the Battle of Saul. These were soldiers who had grown up on stories of the invasion. They had been raised on hatred of They had trained their entire lives for this moment. Admiral addressed them before the enemy arrived. "They are coming to finish what they started," she said. "They want to destroy our world. They want to erase our species from existence. They think we are weak. They think we will break. They are wrong. We have been preparing for this moment for years. When they arrive, they will find not a planet waiting to die, but a graveyard waiting to receive them. Today, we end this war. Today, we make them pay for everything they have done." The soldiers cheered. They were not afraid. They had been born for this fight. And in the distance, the final armada of the Eternal Empire approached, carrying the hopes of a dying empire and the fate of two civilizations. The final battle was about to begin. The final armada dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the human solar system. 5,000 warships, the largest fleet the Eternal Empire had ever assembled. Every surviving vessel from every corner of the Empire had been called to this moment. This was not just an attack. It was the final solution to the human problem. High Archon himself had come to witness the destruction. He stood on the bridge of the command ship, the largest vessel in the fleet, watching as Saul appeared on his. That small yellow star had caused him more trouble than any enemy in 12,000 years of Imperial history. Today, he would finally put an end to it. "Begin the advance," he ordered. "Destroy everything." The Armada moved inward, expecting desperate resistance. They expected a last stand from a dying species. They expected terror and chaos and eventually surrender. What they found was something else entirely. Saul had been transformed. What had once been an unremarkable star system was now the most heavily fortified position in the galaxy. Orbital platforms surrounded Earth, Luna, and Mars, bristling with weapons. Asteroid belts had been converted into killing fields, filled with mines and hidden batteries. Automated defense stations floated in the darkness, waiting to awaken. And at the center of it all, the human fleet waited. 1,500 warships, built in secret shipyards, crewed by soldiers who had spent their entire lives preparing for this moment. Admiral Sarah stood on the bridge of her flagship, the TCS Remembrance. The name had been chosen carefully. Every human ship in the fleet carried the name of someone or something lost in the first invasion. They were fighting for the dead. They were fighting for the future. They were fighting for survival. "All ships, this is Admiral," she broadcast. "The enemy is here. They have come to finish what they started years ago. They want to destroy our world. They want to erase our species. They will fail. Today is the day we end this war. Today is the day the Eternal Empire learns why they should never have come to our home. All ships engage." The battle began. They outnumbered the humans more than 3-1. They had superior technology, superior firepower, superior experience. By every calculation, they should have won. But calculations did not account for what humans had built, and calculations did not account for how humans fought. The automated defense stations activated first, swarming ships with thousands of small attack drones. The drones were not powerful enough to destroy warships on their own, but they distracted sensors, overwhelmed point defenses, and created chaos in formations. Then the mines activated. Hidden among asteroids and debris, they detonated as ships passed, destroying engines and weapon systems. Ships that had survived 100 battles found themselves crippled by weapons they never saw coming. And then the human fleet attacked. They fought with a fury that they could not comprehend. Human ships dove into formations of enemy vessels, firing at point-blank range. When their weapons failed, they rammed. When their engines died, they detonated their reactors. Every human ship became a weapon, even in death. High Archon watched in growing horror as his fleet was torn apart. Ships that had served the Empire for centuries exploded in moments. Commanders who had won 100 victories died, without even seeing the weapons that killed them. "How is this possible?" he demanded. "They are primitives, they should be helpless." But the humans were not helpless. They had spent years preparing for this moment. They had studied every tactic, every weakness, every flaw. They had built weapons specifically designed to counter Imperial technology. They had trained their pilots to fly in ways that commanders could not predict. And they had something they did not have, a reason to fight beyond simple conquest. The humans fought for their families, for their homes, for the memory of everyone who had died in the first invasion. They fought with the knowledge that surrender meant extinction. They fought with rage that had been building for years. By the second day, the advance had stalled. By the third day, they were in retreat. By the end of the week, the final armada was being hunted through the outer planets by human ships that gave no mercy and accepted no surrender. High Archon watched his empire die around him. 12,000 years of rule, ended by a species that had been building pyramids when the empire was already ancient. His flagship was one of the last to fall. Human boarding parties breached the hull on the final day of the battle. They fought their way through corridors filled with soldiers, taking losses but never stopping. When they reached the bridge, they found waiting for them. He was old and tired, and he finally understood the truth that he had for so long. Why, he asked the human soldiers who surrounded him, why fight so hard? Why sacrifice so much? We would have given you a quick death. It would have been painless. The squad leader, a young woman whose grandfather had died in the first invasion, looked at him with cold eyes. Because we are human, she said simply, and we do not kneel. Did not survive the battle, neither did his empire. In the years that followed, the Eternal Empire collapsed completely. Without their fleet, without their leaders, without the fear that had held their subjects in bondage, they had nothing. The species they had enslaved rose up and claimed their freedom. The systems they had conquered became independent worlds. Many of those worlds joined the Terran Confederation, a new alliance built not on conquest but on cooperation. Humans did not try to become new masters. They remembered too well what it felt like to face extinction. But they also remembered their enemies. A century after the final battle, a new warning was taught in every spacefaring academy in the galaxy. Young pilots and captains learned it before they ever took command of a ship. Terran space is forbidden. Do not go there uninvited. Do not threaten them. Do not underestimate them. The last empire that did no longer exists. Some young aliens asked why. Why was one species so feared? Why did everyone treat humans with such caution? The answer was always the same. Because when we came to conquer them, they were divided, primitive, and afraid, and they still nearly destroyed us. Now they are united. Now they are advanced. And they remember everything. They remember every wrong done to them. They will remember for 1,000 years. The old instructor would pause, looking at his students with eyes that had seen too much. Pray you never learn what humans are capable of when they have nothing left to lose. And pray they never have a reason to remember your name. In distant Sol, humanity continued to grow and build and dream. They had faced extinction and survived. They had fought the greatest empire in the galaxy and won. But they never forgot the lessons they had learned. Trust must be earned. Peace must be protected. And sometimes the only way to survive is to become the thing your enemies fear most. Terran space was forbidden. And the humans intended to keep it that way.